3 days before my son's retirement party, I drove to the bakery on Maple Street to pick up the cake I'd ordered. 3 tiers, white fondant, a small edible gold watch on top, because Gerald had been an engineer for 37 years and he deserved something beautiful. Margaret Chen, who'd owned the bakery for as long as I could remember, met me at the counter before I'd even set my purse down. Her face was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Margaret is the kind of woman who smiles when she hands you a paper bag of dinner rolls. That afternoon, she wasn't smiling. She came around the counter, took my elbow, and pulled me gently toward the back room without a word. I thought something had happened to the cake. I was already preparing to be gracious about it. She closed the door behind us. The room smelled like vanilla and warm sugar. There were industrial mixers along one wall and stacks of cake boards against the other. She pressed her finger to her lips and pointed at the wall to our left. I stood there confused until I heard the voices. They were coming from the coffee shop next door. A thin wall, bad insulation, the kind of construction shortcut that suddenly mattered very much. 2 voices. One I didn't recognize. The other one I had known for 11 years. My daughter-in-law, the trust document, is the cleanest way, she was saying. Once Gerald signs over the conservatorship, we move immediately. 48 hours, maybe less. A man's voice, calm and professional. And the mother? She's 64. She's healthy. But we have the neurologist's notes. 3 incidents documented. That's enough to establish a pattern. Margaret was watching my face. I couldn't feel my hands. The accountant said the investment accounts alone are worth $9.5 million, combined with the house and the pension payout. Closer to 14, the man said. 14 million, my daughter-in-law repeated. And there was something in her voice, something I had never heard before. I stood in that bakery stockroom and listened to my son's wife and a man I had never met discuss how to take everything my husband and I had never met, discuss how to take everything my husband and I had spent 40 years building. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there with Margaret's hand on my arm until the voices shifted, scraped chairs, went quiet. Margaret looked at me. She had tears in her eyes. I heard them last week too, she whispered. Same 2 people. Same conversation. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should call. I'm so sorry, June. June! That's my name. June Hartwell. I'm 64 years old, and I was standing in a flour-dusted stockroom trying to understand what I'd just heard. I thanked her. I picked up the cake. I walked out into the afternoon sun and put the box carefully in my back seat and sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. The party was Saturday. 3 days. My son's name is Gerald. He is 39 years old, and he has spent the last decade building a career in civil engineering. He is the kind of man who calls his mother on Sunday mornings. He coached his daughter's soccer team for 5 years, even when the commute was brutal. He is not a complicated person. He is good. His wife's name is Sandra. I had never loved Sandra, if I'm being honest with you. I'd tried. I'd made room for her at every table, included her in every decision, treated her the way I would want to be treated. But there had always been something behind her eyes that I couldn't read, a calculation I couldn't follow. Now, sitting in that parking lot, I thought I finally understood what I'd been looking at. I didn't call Gerald. Not then. I needed to think. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I said a word to anyone. My husband passed away 4 years ago. His name was Roy, and he was the steadiest man I have ever known. He worked for the same construction company for 32 years, saved carefully, invested quietly, and left me with a financial situation that most people in our neighborhood would call comfortable. Roy called it enough. He meant it. The accounts, the house on Willowbrook Drive, the pension payments, they were in my name. Roy was meticulous about that. He always said a woman should have her name on things. Sandra had always seemed mildly annoyed by this. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table where Roy and I had eaten 10,000 meals. I thought about the man's voice on the other side of that wall, professional, efficient, and the phrase neurologist's notes. 3 incidents documented. I had not experienced any incidents. I was sharper at 64 than I had been at 40. I did the crossword every morning, managed my own finances, ran a volunteer program at the public library twice a week. I knew what day it was. I knew who I was. But if someone had been building a record, I opened my laptop. Before we go any further, and I need you to stay with me because this gets harder before it gets better. I want to say that this is a true account of what happened to my family over the course of 1 week. Some names and identifying details have been changed, but the events are real, and the lesson I learned is one I think you need to hear. I searched conservatorship fraud in the state of Tennessee. The results made my stomach drop. It was more common than anyone talked about. Adult children, spouses, professional guardians, people filing to assume legal control over a healthy person's life by manufacturing evidence of cognitive decline. Once a conservatorship was granted, the protected person could lose the right to manage their own money, sell their own home, or make any legal decision without the conservator's approval. I thought about Sandra saying 14 million, like she was reading from a grocery list. I called my neighbour Patricia at 7:30 that evening. She's a retired family court judge. I trust her completely. I told her what I'd heard, every word. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, June, come over right now. I was at her door in 4 minutes. Patricia's kitchen is all yellow light and practical furniture, and she brews the strongest coffee I've ever had. She listened to me again, more slowly this time, taking notes on a legal pad. The man in the coffee shop, she said. Describe his voice. Educated. Measured. He talked about the neurologist's notes like he'd read them. That means there's a doctor involved. She set down her pen. June. This isn't opportunistic, this has been planned. How long? She was quiet. Patricia. To have documentation, to have a legal framework in place. Months. Possibly longer. I thought about the last year, the little moments I'd catalogued and then dismissed. The time Sandra mentioned at Easter dinner that I seemed foggy, and Gerald had frowned at her, and she'd changed the subject. The time I'd arrived at Gerald's house for a birthday dinner, and Sandra had said pleasantly that she thought I was coming tomorrow. I had the text message proving otherwise, but I'd apologized anyway because it was easier. She'd been building the record. I need a lawyer, I said. Yes. And not tomorrow, tonight, if we can manage it. Patricia called a woman named Carol Henderson, a former colleague, now in private practice specializing in elder law and financial fraud. It was 8:45 in the evening. Carol answered on the second ring. 2 hours later, I was sitting in Carol's living room with a yellow notepad of my own and a recording Margaret had made on her phone. She'd had the presence of mind to hit record before she'd come to get me. Bless that woman. And Carol was reading the Tennessee conservatorship statutes on her laptop. The recording is admissible in Tennessee, Carol said. One-party consent. You have motive, you have documentation, and you have a timeline. She looked up. Do you have access to a financial advisor who can verify the account values Sandra was quoting? My accountant, Warren Fields. He's been with me since Roy died. Call him first thing tomorrow. Don't touch any accounts. Don't sign anything. And June, she paused. Don't tell Gerald yet. He's my son. I know. But we don't know what he knows. Not yet. That was the hardest thing she said that night. I drove home at 11 o'clock and stood in my kitchen and looked at the photo on the refrigerator. Gerald and me at his college graduation, both of us squinting in the sun, both of us grinning. He had Roy's jaw and my stubbornness. He was a good man. I needed him to still be a good man when this was over. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called Warren at 7:30. He met me at my kitchen table by 8. I told him what I'd heard. He pulled out his laptop and started running numbers, and then he went very quiet. June, he said after a while, there have been inquiries. What kind? Account queries. From a legal firm, Whitmore and Associates out of Nashville. He turned the laptop to show me. 3 requests in the last 2 months, routed through a financial power of attorney request that Sandra filed in February. I stared at the screen. She filed a power of attorney in February, a preliminary one. It hasn't been executed. It would require your signature or a court order. He looked at me. But it's been drafted. And if they have a conservatorship petition ready to file Monday, the retirement party is Saturday, then Saturday night is when they'd want you to sign something. I called Carol immediately. She had already started the emergency injunction paperwork. She told me she'd also reached out to an investigator she trusted, a man named Frank DeLuca, retired FBI, 22 years in financial crimes. Frank met me at Patricia's house at noon. He was 68, quiet, wore a wedding ring worn smooth with age. He set a recorder on the table and said, "Start from when you walked into the bakery." I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. The man in the coffee shop, did your daughter-in-law use his name? She didn't say it out loud, but she said, the neurologist. Like they'd already discussed which one. And what's the name of Gerald's primary care physician? His physician, I thought. Gerald sees Dr. Arnett. But I see Dr. Morris over at the Hillcrest practice. Frank wrote something down. I'll start there. He left at 1:30 and came back at 5:45 with a folder. In my experience, bad news often comes in threes. It's not superstition, it's just the way deception works. One lie needs 2 more to hold it up. Frank set the folder on the table and opened it. The first thing inside was a photograph. A man outside the Hillcrest medical practice, shaking hands with Sandra in the parking lot. Dated April 14th. Dr. Louis Merritt, Frank said. He's not your primary, but he's part of the Hillcrest group, and as of 3 months ago, he's been filing supplemental cognitive assessments under your file number. My file number. He can do that, not legally without your knowledge, but the assessments are filed under a billing code that runs through insurance without triggering a patient notification. It's a loophole. It gets used in exactly these situations. He looked at me. Dr. Merritt has done this before. A woman in Brentwood in 2020. An elderly man in Cookville in 2022. What happened to them? Frank was quiet for a moment. The woman in Brentwood lost her home. She died in a care facility in 2021. The man in Cookville, his daughter-in-law, was the petitioner. He fought back, and the case was settled out of court. He paused. He's still alive. His name is Arthur Renner, and he's willing to talk to you. The second thing in the folder was a document, a partial draft of the conservatorship petition. My name. The date listed for filing was the Monday after the party. The third thing was a bank statement, an account I'd never seen. The account holder was listed as Hartwell Family Trust, a trust that did not, to my knowledge, exist, and the signatory was Sandra Hartwell. She incorporated this in March, Frank said. Delaware registration. Your name is in the trust documents, June, but you're listed as a beneficiary, not a trustee, not a signatory. The controlling authority is Sandra and a third party whose name I'm still running. I pressed my fingertips against the table and breathed. My son, I said. Where is my son in all of this? Frank looked at me steadily. His name is not on any of these documents. That was not the same as saying he was innocent. We both knew it. I spent Friday going through the motions. The caterers arrived to set up in the backyard. My granddaughter called to say she was driving in from Chattanooga. I smiled. I answered questions about where to put the folding tables. I tasted the appetizers and said everything was perfect. Inside, I was building a case. Carol had filed the emergency injunction that morning. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Drummond, who I did not know but Carol trusted, had approved a temporary freeze on any accounts associated with the Hartwell Family Trust, pending investigation. She'd also authorized the presence of 2 plainclothes officers from the Financial Crimes Unit at Saturday's party. Arthur Renner called me Friday afternoon. He was 71. His voice had a careful quality, like a man who had learned to think before he spoke. They told me I was confused, he said. My own doctor. I had a health scare in 2021, and they used that window. His wife had a neurologist write up 3 incidents that never happened. I never even met the man. He signed a form, and I lost 18 months of my life to a guardianship proceeding before my daughter found a lawyer who would take the case. How did you get out? My daughter, she refused to stop. He paused. Mrs. Hartwell, you have something I didn't have. You found out before they filed. Don't hesitate. I hesitated, and it cost me. I thanked him. I held the phone for a long time after we hung up. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights low and thought about my son. Thought about the boy who used to fall asleep on this couch watching baseball. The man who'd stood beside me at Roy's funeral and held my hand through the whole thing without crying until he thought I wasn't looking. If he knew what Sandra was doing, it would break something I wasn't sure I could repair. If he didn't know, that was almost worse, because it meant she'd found the one person I trusted completely and turned him into a blind spot. I called my neighbour Ruth, who'd known Gerald since he was 12. I asked her to come to the party and sit at the table near the back where she'd have a clear view of everything. She didn't ask why. Ruth knows me well enough to know I don't ask for things without a reason. The next morning came in clear and cool. September in Nashville. The maple in my backyard was just beginning to turn. I got dressed. I put on the blue dress Roy had always liked. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the caterers finish setting up and thought about what I was going to say. Gerald arrived at 11 with my granddaughter, Fern. She's 14 and she launched herself at me from the driveway the way she's done since she was 4. She smelled like the orange shampoo she's used since she was small. I held on a little longer than usual. Sandra arrived separately. She was wearing a cream blazer, and she kissed me on the cheek and said I looked wonderful. I smiled and said the same. We were very good to each other all morning. Guests arrived by the dozens. Colleagues from Gerald's firm, neighbours, family friends, Roy's old business partner who drove down from Louisville. By 2 o'clock, the backyard was full of people who'd known my son his whole life. At 2:30, I saw the man from the bakery wall. He was standing near the drink table, wearing a grey sport coat, talking on his phone. He was about 50, silver hair at the temples. The kind of posture that comes from years of being in rooms where people listen to you. He scanned the backyard with the casual attention of someone measuring distances. I recognized him the same way you recognize weather before it arrives. Something in the air shifts. I texted Frank, he's here. Frank was standing near the garden shed, dressed like any other guest. His reply came back in 30 seconds. Got him. Photo confirmed. Name is Kenneth Pryor, estate attorney. 2 prior conservatorship cases under review by the Tennessee Bar. Sandra had brought her attorney to my son's retirement party. At 3 o'clock, Gerald gave a small speech. He thanked his colleagues. He talked about Roy. He said that everything he knew about building things, structures, relationships, careers, he had learned from watching his parents do it with care. He looked at me when he said it. I nearly lost my nerve. But I thought about the woman in Brentwood who died in the care facility. I thought about Arthur Renner's careful voice. I thought about my own name on documents I'd never signed. At 4 o'clock, the MC, a colleague of Gerald's who'd volunteer for the job, tapped a champagne glass. Ladies and gentlemen, the mother of the guest of honor would like to say a few words. I walked to the small raised area by the flower beds. My note cards were in my hand. The guests went quiet. I looked at my son. 39 years ago, I said, I held this person in my arms for the first time. He weighed 8 pounds, 2 ounces, and he came into the world with his father's frown and the loudest voice I'd ever heard on something so small. Laughter. Gerald grinned. Fern leaned against her father's arm. He has been, every day since, the best thing I have done with my life. I paused. 37 years in the field. Every bridge he's built, every structure he signed his name to, they're still standing. That's his nature. Gerald builds things that last. More applause. I waited for it to settle. I want to talk about what else lasts. My voice was steady. Roy and I spent 40 years building a life together. We weren't wealthy by most measures, but we were careful and we were honest and we built something real. I have spent the 4 years since Roy passed trying to protect what we made together, to make sure it went where it was supposed to go. The yard was quieter now. This week, I discovered that someone had other plans. Sandra's expression didn't change, but she went very still. I'd like to show you something. Frank pressed a button on the laptop connected to the projector we'd set up against the back fence. The guests had assumed it was for a photo slideshow. The first image appeared, a legal document, a conservatorship petition, header printed clearly, in Reed, Junan Hartwell, filed to be submitted Monday, September 16th. Murmurs. Gerald's head turned toward Sandra. This petition, I said, was prepared by Kenneth Pryor, an estate attorney. I looked toward the drink table. Who is here today? Several guests turned. Pryor was very still. If this petition had been filed Monday, and if the accompanying medical documentation had been accepted, I would have lost the legal right to manage my own finances, sell my own home, or make any decisions about my own care. All of that authority would have transferred to my daughter-in-law. The yard was completely silent. Gerald stood up. The medical documentation, I continued, was prepared by a doctor, Louis Merritt, who has never treated me, never examined me, and who has done this, according to court records, at least twice before. I clicked to the next slide. A timeline. 4 months of manufactured incidents, dates and fabricated descriptions filed under my patient number without my knowledge. None of these incidents occurred. My actual physician, Dr. Joanne Morris, has provided a sworn statement to that effect. I held up a folder. I have her statement here, along with a full cognitive evaluation conducted this week by a neurologist at Vanderbilt. The result: no evidence of any impairment whatsoever. A woman near the back made a sound. The financial motive, I said, and clicked to the next slide. The Hartwell Family Trust document. This trust was incorporated in March of this year. In Delaware, the controlling signatory is Sandra Hartwell. It was designed to receive a transfer of approximately $14 million in assets, accounts, property, pension, once the conservatorship was granted. Gerald had not moved. His face was the color of concrete. Sandra stood up. June, this is completely... Sandra. My voice was very quiet. Please sit down. She sat down. I want to be clear about something, I said, and I looked at my son. My son's name is not on any of these documents. I have been told by people whose judgment I trust that he may not have known. Gerald's jaw was working. He looked at his wife. I don't know what you knew, I said. What I know is what I heard on Thursday morning through a wall at Margaret's Bakery. 2 people discussing how to take $14 million from a 64-year-old woman who had the poor judgment to trust the people around her. I nodded at Frank. 2 officers stepped forward from opposite sides of the yard, plainclothes, badges in hand. Kenneth Pryor, the first officer said, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse and filing fraudulent legal documents. Pryor didn't run. He went pale and he put his hands up and he looked at the ground. The second officer walked towards Sandra. Sandra Hartwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, fraudulent incorporation, and financial exploitation of an elderly adult. Sandra said, Gerald. Gerald said nothing. Fern was crying. She had her hands over her mouth and she was looking at her mother and then at me, and she didn't understand any of it. I watched her from the front of the yard and I thought, she's going to need someone steady. That was the thing I held on to. That girl was going to need her grandmother to still be standing. The officers led Sandra and Pryor through the gate at the side of the house. The yard stayed silent long after the sound of footsteps on gravel faded. Then the guests began to move. Some came to me. Some went to Gerald. Ruth sat down next to Fern and put an arm around her and said something quietly, and Fern leaned into her like she was 6 years old. Gerald stood in the middle of the yard for a long time. He looked at the gate they'd taken Sandra through. He looked at me. He walked over slowly. He stopped about 2 feet away. Did you know? I asked. He shook his head. I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I chose to believe him. There was evidence enough to support it. His name was absent from every document. His confusion looked real. His grief looked real. But believing him was also a choice. I made that choice consciously, in full knowledge that I could be wrong. Okay, I said. He put his arms around me. He held on the way he had at Roy's funeral too tightly, like he was afraid I'd disappear. I let him. I should have seen it, he said into my shoulder. Yes, I said. You should have. We're going to talk about that. I know. Not today. But we are going to talk about it. We stood there in the yard while the maple tree dropped one red leaf onto the grass. Fern was watching us from the picnic table. I caught her eye and held out one hand, and she crossed the yard and let me fold her in between us. The 3 of us stood under the September sky and said nothing. It is 6 months later now. The maple is bare, and January has settled over Nashville like a grey wool blanket. Sandra pleaded guilty in December. conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, fraudulent use of legal instruments, financial exploitation. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution. The Hartwell family trust was dissolved. Kenneth Pryor surrendered his law license pending a bar investigation. His own sentencing is scheduled for March. Dr. Marcy, Merritt's medical license is under review by the Tennessee Medical Board. 2 additional patients have come forward since the story was covered by the local news. Gerald and I have had 3 long conversations at my kitchen table, the kind that go until midnight and leave you both exhausted and slightly more honest than you wanted to be. In the first one, he told me everything he remembered, the small comments Sandra had made about my memory over the years, the way she'd gently steered him toward conversations about estate planning, the document she'd asked him to sign in April that he'd signed without reading because she said it was routine and he trusted her. He cried. I let him. Then I told him that trusting someone is not a failure, but trusting someone instead of paying attention is something different. He didn't argue with me. In the second conversation, I asked him about their marriage. He was quiet for a long time. I think I knew something was wrong, he said finally. I just didn't want to look at it. We talked about Roy, about how Roy always said the most expensive thing in the world is something you refuse to see. The third conversation was shorter. Gerald told me he'd filed for divorce. I told him I was sorry, and I meant it. I was sorry for all of it, for the years I'd spent quietly managing my discomfort with Sandra instead of asking better questions, for the way I'd sometimes prioritized my own discomfort over my son's blind spots, for the 40 years I'd spent assuming that keeping things running smoothly was the same thing as keeping things honest. Sandra had found room to operate in the spaces where our family didn't look. Fern comes over on Wednesday evenings. We make dinner together. She's been teaching me what she knows about cooking, which is more than I expected for a 14-year-old. She doesn't talk about her mother much. When she does, I listen without offering opinions she didn't ask for. One night she said, quietly while we were washing dishes, "Grandma, did you hate her?" I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said. "I was afraid of her." "That's different." She thought about that too. Then she dried the pot and put it away and we moved on. My accounts are in order. Carol Henderson helped me restructure the trust properly. Roy's name in the documents alongside mine, Gerald listed as a future beneficiary, but with independent oversight built in. Warren remains my accountant. Patricia Drummond, I learned later, had handled 3 conservatorship fraud cases in her career and recognized the pattern immediately when Carol called her. The world is full of people who have seen this before, I discovered. The trick is finding them before you need them. I went back to Margaret's bakery last week. She had a coffee waiting for me when I walked in. We sat at the small table by the window and she told me she'd been worried every day since the party that she'd done the wrong thing by getting involved. "You saved my life," I told her, or something close to it. She waved that off the way she waves off everything, with the particular modesty of someone who has always done the right thing and found it unremarkable. Then she cut 2 slices of lemon cake and we ate them without saying much. And outside, the January light moved slow and thin through the bare trees on Maple Street. Last Sunday, Gerald and Fern came for dinner. We ate pot roast and argued about a football game and Fern fell asleep on the couch in her socks. Gerald washed the dishes without being asked. When he was done, he came and stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at his daughter sleeping and then at me. "I keep thinking about what would have happened," he said, "if you hadn't gone in for the cake." "Don't," I told him. "It's hard not to." "I know. But we're here. That's what matters." I looked at him. "You know what your father used to say, the most expensive thing in the world is something you refuse to see." I nodded. "Look at things, Gerald. That's all. Just keep looking." He stood there for a while. Then he said goodnight and carried Fern to the car in the January cold, the way he used to carry her when she was small, and there was no weight in the world he couldn't bear. I stood in the doorway and watched the taillights disappear down Willowbrook Drive. I went back inside. I washed my coffee cup. I stood at the kitchen window where Roy and I used to do the crossword on Saturday mornings, and I thought about what it costs to refuse to see something and what it costs to look, and I decided, again, that I would keep choosing to look, even when it's hard, especially then. I think about Margaret a lot, about the fact that she could have said nothing. She'd heard the same conversation the week before and spent 7 days carrying it alone, turning it over, wondering if it was her place. Most people would have kept walking. Most people do, but she saw me come through that door, and she made a choice in about 4 seconds that changed the course of my life. That's what a decent person looks like in practice. Not grand gestures, not speeches, just a hand on your elbow and a quiet voice that says, "You need to hear this." What Sandra built against me didn't happen overnight. That's the part I had to sit with. She spent months constructing something careful and patient. The offhand comments about my memory at family dinners, the documents slipped into the routine paperwork, the attorney who showed up at my own son's party like a guest. She was counting on the fact that people who love each other tend not to look too hard at each other. She was counting on Gerald's trust in her and my trust in him, and the comfortable assumption that the people inside your own home are not the ones you need to protect yourself from. She was right about all of it, until she wasn't. The thing about consequences is that they don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly in the background, and then they arrive all at once. Sandra made choices for nearly a year that she believed were invisible, and every one of those choices left a trace, a document, a timestamp, a phone recording, a parking lot photograph. Frank found them because he knew where to look. Carol knew what to do with them because she'd seen this pattern before. Patricia recognized the petition the moment Carol called her. The people who ultimately stopped Sandra were people who had spent their careers paying attention. That's not luck. That's what it looks like when knowledge is taken seriously and applied with care. I'm not a particularly brave person. I want to be clear about that. I sat in that parking lot for a long time before I started the engine. I called Patricia instead of Gerald because I was afraid of what Gerald might say. I went through Friday acting like everything was fine because I didn't trust myself to do anything else. What I had was not courage exactly. It was the refusal to stop moving. I kept making the next phone call. I kept gathering the next piece of information. I kept getting up in the morning and doing what needed to be done, even when I couldn't see how it would end. I've heard people call that resilience, but it didn't feel like anything that dignified. It just felt like putting one foot in front of the other until I could see a little further ahead. Gerald is doing that now too. Putting one foot in front of the other. He's a good man who made the very human mistake of trusting someone he loved instead of looking clearly at what was in front of him. Roy used to say the most expensive thing in the world is something you refuse to see. Gerald knows that now in a way he didn't before. Fern is learning it younger than she should have to. I'm still learning it, honestly. I think most of us are. What I know is this. The 3 things that kept me from losing everything were not money, not status, not luck. They were the character to tell the truth, even when it was going to hurt people I loved. The clarity to understand what I was actually looking at once Margaret put me in that room. And the stubbornness to keep going when every part of me wanted to sit down and cry instead. Those 3 things, working together, were the only wall I had. I intend to keep building it,